Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to everyone who's here. I mean, every time you see the someone's joined the waiting room, it's just such a delight to know that there are people who are interested and engaged in this topic enough to make time for it. So yeah, as one of you already mentioned, some of you weren't able to make last week. That's totally fine. Life gets busy, and we have the recording. You can watch it if you want to play some catch up. But I'm also actually going to start where Krista left off a little bit and then build from there. So today we're looking at the question, what is a human? And we're going to look at that from multiple perspectives, but primarily through scripture and this thing that we call theology, which is really talk about God and in light of God, who are we and how should we live? So in the first session, Krista helpfully offered us a history of the common language and rhetoric used to describe disability or people with disabilities from the 18th century until now. And far from offering just an information and an informative history lesson with a few interesting facts about the past, present, and possible future of disability language, Krista's seminar helped us to see the numerous ways in which the words people use to describe disability reveals, and in some cases reinforces, past and present realities for people with disabilities. And many of these realities are not only disturbing, they're problematic and damaging. So in this session, we're going to build on that work that Krista did by turning our attention to the vision of the human that informs this language and these realities. So behind this language are visions of the human. Oh, come on in. Laura's just very kindly bringing me coffee. She's off screen, but yeah, she just provided me some fuel, which is thank you, Laura. Okay, so behind these words are people and visions of what a person is. Because if you recall what Krista shared, one of the key developments with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution regarding visions of the normal or average person, I put those in scare quotes intentionally, or citizen was as follows. To be considered a normal person and a true citizen, or more bluntly, to be considered human, you had to, one, possess reason or demonstrate a certain level of intelligence. So that's the Enlightenment. And two, you had to be productive. So that's the Industrial Revolution. And with that, a troubling question emerges. If this is an accurate account of what makes a human, does this mean someone is not a human or not a person if he or she does not have reason, cannot be productive, or both? So the implicit and at times explicit answer we encountered, of course, was indeed, if you don't have reason, if you can't be productive, or both, then that means at least you are subhuman, and at most it means you're not human at all. Now, as shocking as it is to hear the visions of the human and the citizen stated so directly, and as much as we may want to consider such visions to be nightmares and nightmarish artifacts of the past, I want us to reflect for a moment upon the degree to which common North American visions of the human and the citizen really departed from this. So we looked at history, but I want us to reflect, just like, have we actually left that behind, or is it still here? And further, so that's like social level, but more particularly at the local church level, the local church in North America, I want us to reflect on the degree to which the average local church and the average Christian has really departed from this vision of the person. Or to put the question more bluntly, what if the vision of the human most of us grew up being taught in Sunday school, and what if the vision of the human most of us hear preached from the pulpits in our churches today is more representative of an Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution vision of the human than it is representative of a Christian, that is, a scriptural vision of the human? So that's a long question, so I'll put it on the next slide. So what are your initial thoughts? One of the things that we talked about last time we met, and I'll share again here, is this is a safe place to discover, learn, and grow. And just because we may have thought of things in a certain way, or thinking of things in a certain way, or doing things in a certain way, or have done things in a certain way, it doesn't mean you're a terrible person. It just means that there's opportunity for growth and change. And this is the beauty of the gospel, is that change is always possible. And God doesn't just say, you need to change and then come to me, but I will create change within you and I'll journey with you. And so this is a space where we can, as Greg says, I've taught enough with Greg before. He says, hey, let's just all say what we're thinking out loud and then see if it's Christian or not. And I love that. Like, let's just give ourselves space to do that work, because that's the only way that growth and change happens, right? So yeah, I think in a lot of ways, you're right though too, Priscilla, that it's not like someone says this directly, right? It kind of looms under the surface, or it's sort of an atmosphere. And one way to know is, what do we envision when we envision the type of person we want to lead our small groups, or the type of person that we want to be on our elders board, or our next hire for a leadership role? Who are we envisioning? Again, I'm going to steal from Greg here. We probably envision somebody like tall, able-bodied, runs a business effectively, or works in the corporate world, right? Probably, does marathons, and that sort of thing. Like, that's who we want. Probably male, blonde hair, blue eyed, and then their family, that's perfect. They're always perfectly manicured. They're well behaved. They come right. Like, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there, but I feel like that's what a lot of people envision when they think about the A team for their church. So that says a lot about the sort of substructural vision of the human that we bring into the Christian life and how we do church. So another question then, if reason and productivity are not as central to the Christian vision of the human as they may initially appear to be, then what is central to the Christian vision of the human? So this is to say, yeah, there are biblical texts that place value upon thinking, reason, and work and productivity. But there are other texts that speak about other aspects of being human, and equally valuable, if not more, from a scriptural perspective, which of course scriptures come from God. So then what will we do, if there are other things, what will we say is central to the Christian vision of the human? Like, someone saying, where in the Bible does it talk about being human? Where would you go? But you mentioned the Imago Dei. I mean, not even just, from a sort of systematic theology class or from a pastor's sermon, but even in sort of the classic human rights speech, right? We talk about the human as being created in the image of God. But here's a question. What is the image of God? Isn't it interesting that one of the common responses is, well, the image of God is what? Rationality and creativity. That sounds a lot like enlightenment and productivity, just a little bit of a different word, right? But is that what Scripture says about the human? So let's go there. I want to take us to Colossians. Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created. So, Victoria, great starting point. Jesus. Right. And then it goes on to talk about how he's over everything and in everything. And in him, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So from this perspective, it actually means we need to modify slightly the question, what is the image of God, by changing it to the following. Not what, but who is the image of God. Yeah. Slight modification, significant implications. The image of God is not a thing. The image of God is not a capacity. So the image of God is not reason, rationality, productivity, creativity, dominion, morality, etc. The image of God is a person. not just any person, but the person, Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word, the incarnate Son of God. And if this is the case, then what does that mean for human beings being the image of God? Well, I find images, pun intended, I like puns, like the following help us answer that question in visual form. We are all images of the image, diverse copies of the original true image. So in one sense, there's a grandiosity to this, like the image, the original true image, images of God. Humans have some capacities like the ones presented in Genesis 1, right? Dominion, multiplication, fruitfulness. So here's another image capturing those capacities. Right? This is the scene with Adam in the garden naming all the animals. Right? That's in the foreground of this image here. Okay? But in the background, Adam is in the process of being created by God. And Christ is the archetype for that person being created. So if you think about it in this way, we're formed from the ground, and then it's the breath of God that animates that material. Well, the reference for us is Christ. And that sort of spills out into all different images of that archetypal image. So to summarize, the image of God is a person, Jesus Christ, the perfect image of the invisible God. It's not a capacity. And so that means all people are images of the image of God, full stop. Okay, so the fall does complexify this a little bit, and we will get into that and how that specifically relates to disability. So I just want to sideline that for a second. But I also just want to take some time to just say all people are images of the image, full stop. So nobody has the image of God. It's not a possession. Everybody is an image of God. And this distinction is important for our understanding of humanness, because to have the image of God implies that it can be taken away, whereas to be an image of God means that it can't be taken away. So the fall does complicate this being images of God, but it doesn't remove the fundamental fixed imaging. And Colossians bears witness to this, as do other biblical texts, some of which we'll look at in a moment. But first, here's a theologian called Vincent Lloyd who comments on the implications of what we have in view here. He says this: just as God exceeds all worldly descriptions, the image of God in humanity exceeds all worldly descriptions. We offer worldly descriptions as approximations for what is ultimately unrepresentable. And those worldly descriptions succeed when they remind us how their referent, God, exceeds them. So Lloyd goes on to describe, when we laugh, we image God. When we are sad because we lose something, we image God. Yes, when we create something, we image God. Yes, when we think about things like we're thinking about here, we're imaging God. But that core image piece, it's not summarized by all of those things. It's all of those things and more, because God is all of those things and activities and more. So Lloyd continues. So an irreducible mystery remains. It is because of this irreducibility, this mystery, that humans are identified with God. For God is also ultimately mysterious, irreducible to the terms of the world. To reduce God would be to make God into an idol. Significantly, the many qualities of the human mark the ways in which humans reflect the image of God. God is not an abstract mind or a divine watchmaker. God must also involve both reason and emotion, mind and heart. So here is one of many scriptural examples that capture this truth in all of its wondrous beauty. I'm not going to read all of it because I think it's probably familiar to you, but Matthew 25, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And then the king will say to those at his right hand, come you that are blessed by my Father, right? Um, Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. So this is God's presence. This is God's image within the people that the world so often says, well, surely God's not present there. Surely they don't image God in the way that other more powerful, influential people do, right? So here are some more images that capture the spirit of this text and what it means for being human, for being images of the perfect image of God. So this is an iconographer called Kelly Lattimore, and I really like the work that he does.
Hmm.
So the person in the chair beside who Kelly Lattimore calls the homeless Christ is Dorothy Day, who started the Catholic worker movement. So here's another image that he does of Dorothy Day welcoming Jesus and his family into um, one of the Catholic worker homes.
Mhm.
So these and so many more people are images of God, the perfect image of God. So what this means, practically speaking, is that the visions of being human on offer today and in the past can be limited, very limited, severely and destructively limited, and not just in the wider world, but outside the church and inside the church too. And the reason I say that is because the Imago Dei theologies that many of us grew up being taught and which we still hold to today, and therefore the ones that we teach and inform how we live, can therefore also be limited and severely destructive. So maybe today, God wants to broaden, deepen, transform our visions of being human and your Imago Dei theologies. Or maybe some of you, this is just encouraging that like you just you maybe you have lived experience or you've journeyed with somebody and you're like, I know that they are just as much an image as anybody else, but I haven't had the opportunity to think like all the way to the end why that is or how that is or have the words to describe it. And this is the gift of scripture in this thing that we call theology is it gives us those words, right? So some of us, this may be a challenge, but some of us, this may be encouragement. But wherever we're coming from, like, this is good news. This opens up so much space for not just like our theoretical theologies, but the way in which we engage the world and the people in it. We then become more likely to be constantly surprised by the ways that God is imaged through people and ways that we'd never expect. So, with that in view, I want to return to Genesis, this time to the second chapter, to focus on how personhood in the Imago Dei is depicted there. So, we talked a little bit about this in one of the early images I showed, right? We're formed out of the ground, and and the breath of God is breathed into us, and then the woman is created out of Adam's side. So, here are some images that capture what's written here. So here, Adam is kind of half formed out of the clay. Um, and then in this one, Eve is being like pulled out of Adam's side. And this is kind of cool where it's like God is breathing into Adam and Eve. It kind of looks like spaghetti though, but it's divine spaghetti that gives you the spark. So this I like these images because they capture like how we are formed from the earth. Now, of course, these illustrations are very like Scandinavian people. So that's just, artists tend to render God and scriptural scenes to look like themselves. It's just what happens. But, maybe this is news, but the original humans, Adam and Eve, were Jewish, right? So not blonde haired, blue eyed. Um, so anyway, so I notice here relationship, connection, tenderness, incomplete formation, and consequently dependence. Dependence, right? Look at the way in which God is clutching hands in both dependence on God and creation. So the soil, right? We depend on the soil back then, and we depend on it now for our very existence, right? Food grows out of it. We're made from the soil, into the soil we return. And we're dependent on God for our existence, and we're dependent on other people. So Eve comes from Adam's side, and they are dependent on each other, right? They're each other's helpers. So, what is a human? To summarize here, well, a human is an image of God. And to be an image of God is to be dependent on God, other people, and creation for our existence. So here is where what is commonly called disability comes into view. So John Swinton and Stanley Hauerwas write the following on this. Within modernity, dependence is perceived to be the antithesis of the good life. Individualism, so Eric, this is what you were getting at, with all of its accretions, is presumed to be the norm for authentic human living. That being so, the lives of people with intellectual disabilities stand in sharp negative tension with cultural expectations. However, the essence of the Christian tradition is that human beings are wholly dependent. Far from being an indication of a lack of human fulfillment, the lives of people with intellectual disabilities are in fact a reminder of the true state of all human beings. Their existence is nothing more and nothing less than a concentrated vision of normality. And they continue. Reflection on the lives of people with profound intellectual disabilities is therefore a context for learning what it means to be a creature or created by God. Learning to be a creature means to recognize that our existence and the existence of the universe itself are gifts. If all is gift, then dependency is our natural state. The lives of people with profound intellectual disabilities, far from being problematic, marked by suffering or raising intellectual dilemmas, in fact inform us of what human life and human living is really like. And here's what's interesting is not only does this permeate church cultures, it actually permeates the not-for-profit world too. One of the strategic goals, which isn't totally bad all the way down, but if we list a strategic goal, what do we often hear? We want to get them to independence, right? And that's not because there are some people who can work towards a certain level of independent living, independent work, independent, say, marital relationships, so forth. But what about the people within those communities who cannot? How do we factor them into our strategic goals? And how do they bear witness to this individual or individualistic ideology that's creeped into the very good ministry that we do, but has individualism become an ideal? And is that actually an ideal in the kingdom of God? A God who says, I'm the vine, you're the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And even a God within God's self shows us voluntary dependence, right? And the incarnation is such a beautiful rendering of this. Yes, a super powerful cosmic God, right? Colossians, but also the God who emptied himself, becoming the form of a slave and said, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, right? So this is you can't pin God down because he's that big, right? Um, Big, small, totally powerful, but also voluntarily uh has needs. So what does this mean? Jesus, the perfect imago Dei and bearing human flesh, chose to become dependent. And we, being images of this perfect image, are likewise called to be dependent creatures. So being a disciple and being the church is about discovering this dependence and learning with God, ourselves, and others to navigate its wonders and complexities. And everyone, including people with disabilities, can help us on this journey of discovery and learning. And so, despite what many of us have been taught and even maybe feel sometimes, dependence is not shameful. It's human. And embracing dependence makes us more, not less of the humans, the images of God that God makes us to be. And so while we live in a fallen world, that's Genesis 3, that is being actively redeemed by God, that's Romans 8, disability is not necessarily a sign and or condition of the fall. So so this is an ongoing discussion within the disability theology world. Um, there's no sort of like not everybody agrees on how to navigate this question, but I do want to give two scriptures that really run against the grain of what your average person would say about disability and whether it is or is not a sign of the fall. So Exodus 4, when God calls Moses, and Moses gives God a list of reasons why he can't be the guy that leads Israel. Moses said to the Lord, "Oh my Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant. But I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue." And then the Lord said to him, "Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seen or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak." And then in John 9, as Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." So that actually may be, again, encouraging for some people, but it also may be challenging for others, not just because you have an implicit or explicit ableism at play, but because of maybe some of the challenges you've experienced yourself because of lived experience, or because someone that you journey with who has lived experience with disability. So I've presented material like this before, and I have gotten emails from people who say, yeah, I get a little bit of what you're saying, but given the struggles that I've gone through, or given just how hard it's for me as a parent or a friend or a sibling, I don't buy this. Like, I don't buy this idea that parts or whole of disability aren't something to do with the fall. And this isn't to just say that if you're coming from that perspective, you're wrong. It's to say this is an open question, and I don't know that any of us will ever be able to fully land in one place or another until Jesus comes back. Um, we see in part, soon we'll see in full. But at the very least, what I think these texts do is complicate and get us to at least pause and reflect before we point to someone with a disability and say, this person is the way they are because somebody sinned or because Adam and Eve did this, right? And from there we can start to say, well, maybe not, and if not, then maybe I have to rethink and rework my understanding of what disability is and what a person is and what the image of God is, like we're doing here. Um, okay, so that's my presentation. So I have some questions. I saw lots going on in the chat. So what I'm going to do, I want to dialogue with all of you. So maybe using the raise hand function, if you have a question or you have a comment in response to these questions, then we'll just go through it that way for the remainder of our time. How does that sound? Does that sound good? Okay, so here's some questions, some prompts. We don't have to talk about all of them. You may just want to throw another question or comment out there, but here's some things to think about. So number one, how would you describe the Imago Dei? We already touched on that a little bit. Is there anything in your description of the Imago Dei that you feel like you would change in light of what I just shared? How has this session informed your understanding of being human? And how might all of the above change the ways that we approach discipleship in the church? Right. So not even just like who who can we disciple, but who can disciple us. And I really like the second part of that question. And Greg's doing a doctorate on it as well. But when I say discipleship, it's like, how does this totally rework what we think about when we think about who are is not only discipleship material, but like who are good disciplers? And I'll just drop those questions in the chat. Okay, Krista, you raised your hand.
Raise my hand. Just to like add another element to this conversation too, something that I've been really thinking about recently. It comes from First John chapter 3, where it says, Beloved, we are God's children. This is totally also spoiler alert. If you follow my Substack, this is the next post. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. Seeing him as he is. And what that spurred in me or ignited in me was this idea of like, oh, we have to be really careful because we're also placing um, our societal values on God. So all those ideas of enlightenment and industrial revolution and what we believe to be a God and a person who should be in charge, we're placing those expectations on the God. And it just made me think like we have to be really careful that we don't do that. It was see him as he is, because quite frankly, we don't understand. We don't know who he is. So when we say made in the image of God, we actually might be placing attributes on God that are not truth.
Yeah, love it. Yeah. Uh, One of the things that uh Saint Augustine said is really just what is a human? Well, here's some thoughts, but we also need to be willing to be surprised, just in a way that same with God, right? And we see this all throughout the Gospels. I mean, all throughout the Bible, but I just Peter comes to mind. Some days Peter's just knocking it out of the park in terms of identifying who Jesus is, but in the next breath he's totally hitting a foul ball or striking out. And he strikes out when he thinks he knows better than Jesus, right? Surely you can't go and die, right? You're supposed no. Greg, you have your hand up.
Yeah, piggybacking a little bit off of what Krista said, the idea of seeing him as he is. It's Ascension Day for all of you who party that way. So congratulations to those of you who party hard on Ascension Day.
Yeah.
But you know, one of the realities of the ascended, reigning Jesus is that he is still embodied. He is still incarnate. And according to at least some categories, particularly Roman categories, he is eternally outside the ideal body because he is not Gentile. He is Jewish, which is not as good as being a Roman. And his body is not whole because it is pierced on the side and there are wounds in his hands. And so as we see the ascended Christ as he is, we see a person who by at least one culture's set of standards is a not normal, not ideal person. And so I think that's helpful for us in this conversation to realize that Jesus, the full, perfect image of God, falls outside at least the standards of some culture's view of what the ideal person ought to be. And so that brings, I think, a layer of helpfulness to this conversation that the resurrected Christ is, by some standards, not ideal. And what does that mean for us as we continue in this conversation, I think is maybe a helpful thing to think through.